Hey, hello, welcome or welcome back. What do you say we talk about a book? And no surprises here because you all clicked on a thumbnail. Presumably. If you didn't, I would be very curious in how you got here. But we are going to be talking about Faebound by Saara El-Arifi today because romantasy is going to get me yet. Now, I did read this in both this wonderful physical library edition, and I also had the audiobook because it is read by Bonnie Turpin, who is one of my favorite narrators. And I realized as I was listening, I don't think I've listened to a book from her for a second, which is a shame. So it's a good thing that we rectified that. Now, this is being billed as a romantasy title. And while I'm aware of the genre, because I have not been living under a rock, I am not as widely read in it as even I would presume I would be. And ironically enough, as I was reading this book, I watched Mara from Books Like Woe's vlog, where she was kind of reading a bunch of romantasy titles, and in that video also kind of assessing her thesis about what she thought romantasy was against the book she was reading, and I definitely kind of aligned with her in a lot of ways in that conception, so I will of course link that below, but it got me thinking about it in terms and context of this book, because one of the things that was discussed is this idea that romantasy kind of sits in this liminal space. You know how I feel about a liminal space, so there's surely a better way to talk about it, but I'm a little slap happy. It's the end of the week. Here we are, kind of in between adult and young adult in terms of the narrative structures and the kind of framing and just the writing of the thing sometimes, and how that can sometimes kind of be uncomfy, but also in the fact that the romance in these books is often a subplot, not the main driver, and we aren't guaranteed a happily ever after at the end of these books because they are often, like with this book, part of a longer series, but that the couples that we are presumably supposed to be rooting for are laid out pretty specifically for us. Now, there are always caveats and exceptions to the rule, and many times we don't really have the end of a lot of these big series that have popped off recently, so we don't technically know how they're gonna end, which is something Mara touched on as well. So all that to say, the characters and the leads in this book are decidedly adult, at least in relation to their age. So in this book, we are following two sisters, Yirin and Lettel. Lettel is 28, Yirin is in her early 30s, and so they are full-grown adults. We meet Yirin as she is already in a very long-standing committed relationship, which as a reader raises some red flags, right? You're like, this is probably not going to be where we're going to be by the end of the book, and sure enough, not really a spoiler because it's in the first part of the book. It indeed is not where we are by the end of the book, but is surely being planted for some additional emotional angst and conflict in further books, I would presume. But we start with Yirin as she is celebrating becoming the youngest colonel in the Army's history. And we start even before that, I guess I should say, with a preface of the mythology of this world. Because Yirin and her sister Lettel are elves, and within this world we have elves, fae, and humans, except we don't have fae and humans because they have been completely wiped out. Or at least that's what we presume, because the book is indeed called Faebound, so we can make some assumptions there. And also the blurb and all of the promotion of this book have teased very specific presumptions there. So Yirin is part of a very specific elvish clan that is involved in this long-standing war, this long-standing battle over a limited resource. And this war is established so much so that there are like permanent structures that have been constructed on the battlefield. So this is a society that has only ever known war. And Yirin herself has really only ever known war. She has found her identity through conflict and structure and camaraderie, what have you, as well as love. And then we have Lettel, who is, of course, Yirin's sister, and she is a seer of sorts. In this world, specifically labeled a diviner, she reads bones, she reads entrails, she foresees things. And she has come to Yirin on this day of celebration for her to basically present this prophecy that she has had about her sister and this idea of glory in the east. And so when Yiren goes out to battle, she has this prophecy kind of stirring. Things aren't quite right in terms of what the scouts had reported back. And long story short, she ends up leading her people into an ambush. And so then she has to face the punishment of this, which is somewhat harsh, but also more lenient than death, because of some dynamics that are a delightful surprise within the book itself. And so this forces her into exile, and Lettel follows her, but also one of Yiren's fellow officers, one of the men that was with her that day, and he carries a lot of guilt and feels like he shares the burden of that decision in a lot of ways. And so he follows Lettel and Yiren into this exile of sorts. Lettel thinks she's just doing kind of a rescue mission. Yiren has concocted this grand plan of how to overcome this exile and win back the good graces of her leader. And this plan involves the hunting of a mystical creature within this world, an obeah, animals who are used in Elvish society as weapons. We see Yiren being gifted this elaborate, beautiful drum at the beginning of the book, a drum made out of this beautiful obeah skin, and then the magic of that drum and that drum being used as a weapon. And I loved the kind of magic system there and the visuals of that drum warfare. I thought that was really interesting. What she couldn't have foreseen is that obeahs are intrinsically linked with the Fae, who are not in fact gone from the earth, but have been living kind of in isolation and hiding by necessity. And so in hunting and slaughtering this obeah, she has committed this grand crime against the Fae and is brought back to be sentenced for her crime. Things, of course, become immensely more complicated, especially in relation to Fury, the Fae who ultimately captures her and carries a lot of hatred towards Yiren for most of the book, and yet there is still this spark and this attraction between the two, particularly with Yiren in that attraction. I mean, it's fair. We're seeing everything from her point of view. And so the outset and the kind of setup of this novel is incredibly interesting. I love the world creation. I love these characters. Everything is very active in the beginning. It feels like we are being given information as readers in a very cinematic way as we're kind of moving along with these characters and discovering a lot of the world then very organically because of that. Unfortunately, this does falter for me somewhat, particularly in the second half of the book, and maybe it's because we, like our characters, are trapped in this Fae realm and can't get out, but it doesn't feel like we're exploring things as organically then. It doesn't feel like we're being shown as much like we were in the beginning, but we start to be kind of told things, and this unfortunately starts to bleed into the characters and their relationships particularly as well, particularly from the romantic angle, which I want to spend some time on, particularly because this is being marketed as romantasy, and there is that effort to really seed these relationships. We have this kind of forbidden attraction between Lettel and Rayan, the member of Yiren's company that has followed along, but that forbiddenness isn't born of having Yiren as a commander or anything of that sort, but rather Lettel's prophecies. And the prophecies are so interesting, and Lettel as a character is so interesting because of the prophecies, and I do really enjoy the way prophecy is handled here. This idea that it is fluid, this idea that it's this thing that has been handed over to you in some way, this information that is so utterly life-changing, but you don't ultimately know what it's referring to until it's too late. And we have characters that have shaped their entire lives around a prophecy, or whose entire lives have been shaped against their will in some ways by a prophecy, but that we don't have as much of a sense of the action of that. And we know that Lettel is an expert in some ways. She is highly gifted. She is advanced in her studies in her home, but we don't really get to see much of that. We have to kind of take that on faith of the narrative in relation to that. And then when we get to the Fae realm, the way that she practices is completely turned on its head, particularly because the Fae don't eat meat. She can't slaughter an animal to read the bones because that involves killing, and that's not going to work. And so there is a little bit of an exploration of her kind of identity crisis there, this thing that she has dedicated her whole life to. She has had ripped from her in some ways, this sense of purpose and identity, especially in relation to her relationship with her sister, because as much as there are these romances that are so central to the story, the relationship between Lettel and Yiren in particular is incredibly important to this novel, and this idea that Yiren abandoned Lettel when they were younger in some ways, but also the way that their bond has kind of transcended this and the secrets that both of them are keeping, but also what they're willing to sacrifice for the other in spite of that. So there are a lot of dynamics to play with, and all of the dynamics are there, and there's the potential to really live in that nuance. And I think we're like almost there. We're just like a hair's breadth away in some places. And I think the prophecies and the way the prophecies operate are part of this. And this also circles back to this relationship, I promise, because Lettel's relationship and her view of her attraction and or relationship with Rayan is kind of viewed and filtered through this prophecy and her interpretation of a particular prophecy. And I think part of the reason I wanted to see more active engagement with the world building and kind of the action of prophecy within the book is because prophecies can be really hard in fantasies as a reader because they're so prescriptive in some ways, and if they're not handled with more nuance, it feels like an easy kind of plot gimmick. It feels like a deus ex machina in some ways. And so this whole relationship has this like intense attraction that is built very quickly over the course of them kind of chasing after Yiren. So we're supposed to kind of believe in the buildup of this angst, and then we have this extra like forbidden layer added. And I say it with that tone that seems a little dismissive because it started out really good for me. I really liked that idea of that kind of pining. They're on the road together. There's that attraction kind of simmering, but will they, won't they? I thought there was a good buildup there, and we really lost the momentum of it, and it became a little bit more trite and predictable in some ways. And I think that the idea of the prophecy played directly into that. And then on the other side of things, we have Yiren, who is being set up in this rivals to lovers dynamic. And I will give them this. They are decidedly rivals at the beginning of the book and for most of the book in a way where sometimes the shift of that was hard to find outside of a blunt attraction, which, I mean, a blunt attraction, it happens, right? So spoiler kind of in terms of pairing, or at least what I interpret the ships to be, but we have Yiren being attracted to and kind of like developing this relationship with Fury, the Fae who initially captures her. And there is a reason that Fury is so angry at Yiren. Is that why her name is Fury? Maybe, because that is kind of her one note for a lot of the book, I'm not gonna lie. But that being said, having a lesbian romance as one of the main romances in this romantasy series, and arguably the A plotline romance, was great to see. And the way that gender and sexuality in particular were handled in this book was really great. It was really subtle, matter-of-fact world building that showed where the world building worked. It worked so well. And there are definitely other examples of this throughout the book. We don't really get to explore a lot of the Fae realm, but that might be because we need to keep our characters a little tighter. Like, there was a character that was constantly referencing going to the bar or the pub after having spent a lot of time in captivity in the Fae realms, and I think that there is a reason we don't necessarily go with him to those places, but at the same time, we don't really get a sense that those places exist in this world to some extent, but the relationships start to become a focus. This is also where the pacing kind of struggles for me sometimes, kind of mid-book toward the end, in that we are kind of just killing time, spinning wheels. It doesn't feel like we have as many active things to do in this place, or there's not as many plot points that are forcing our characters together. It feels like we're just spending this time trying to get our characters in the relationships and personal dynamics we need them in for the end, which is incredibly successful. I really enjoyed the end, but we are kind of spinning our wheels for a little bit. And in some ways, there's a moment where Lettel accuses Yiren of giving up and just biding time. So there is some self-awareness there, like to some extent, part of that is purposeful, but as a reader, we don't really know what we're reading toward, because as a reader, there is this idea of this end date, this thing that Yiren is training for, this kind of escape that they're hoping to plot, but we kind of lose sight of that somewhat as a reader. And then on top of all of this, we have the Obeah of it all, because Obeah are magical creatures that bond with the Fae, and if you have bonded with an Obeah, you are Faebound. So you're all very intelligent, astute people, and I'm willing to bet many of you can guess where this is going, but one of our characters does bond with an Obeah, something that is supposed to be only possible for the Fae. We kind of touch on that, but not really. That is something it feels like is being set up for later, which I like. We supposedly have a whole trilogy here, which we do set up some moves. Clearly at the end of the book, we're setting up a different power structure, a different dynamic, and so there are places to go, but we have some of these threads that are being kind of dangled early. I do appreciate that. But that means we have a bond with a magical creature. If you have been a fan of dragon bonding and those telepathic conversations, this is for you. I struggled a little bit with this side of things simply because our bond mate in this felt or read very much like a precocious child, which, to be fair, I think was incredibly purposeful, but precocious children either really work or they really don't for me in fiction, and I couldn't fully gauge this. It felt like we just have this character throwing out this wisdom to throw out wisdom in some ways, and it didn't always land for me. Additionally, we're supposed to believe this is a very intense, intimate relationship, and to my estimation, we don't really spend enough time developing that organically, which I think also circles back to my critique of how some of the romance is being handled in this. Not because I don't want that connection and that romance. Clearly, if you've been here for a second, you know I love that romance, but because we do get some really steamy, intimate scenes in here, and I am not opposed to those. However, they didn't feel as earned as I wanted them to be. I wanted them to feel like a moment, and rather they felt like a moment we just had to check off. And I think it's hard because I can see where all of the pieces fit together. I don't think this was a badly written book by any means. I really enjoyed it, but there were these moments that I think could have been even further elevated, and I think that there was just another step that could have happened there. At the same time, I see again where all the plotting kind of leads. I think maybe if we had taken some of that time where it felt like we were stalled a little bit more in the middle, the second third of the book, to kind of establish a little bit of that more, which, to be fair, that's what we were doing or attempting to do during that time. It worked to varying degrees in my book, which brings me back to the idea of like their ages, because at the beginning of the book, I was like, yeah, these are adult characters, and I started to lose that sense of them as fully adult. In some of the later choices, they started to feel a little younger, and not like they were children by any means, but just that I lost a little bit of that sense of them. And it's hard because these characters have lost the sense of themselves in this world, this idea that everything that they've known about themselves has been completely stripped away. And I think that that's something that the narrative is directly engaging with, but that could have been tightened a little bit more, especially when things like the prophecies and some of our dialogue from our Obeah feels a little bit more on the nose, and it's not like we as readers are getting to some of these big ideas and themes that I really enjoy being explored as naturally, and I think it could trust us as readers just a little bit more in that respect. Also, if you have read this book, I have a genuine question for you regarding the timeline of this mythology and this world that I may just be misinterpreting. Okay, to my reading, the Fae have only been able to go topside, even in their limited means, for around 100 years. But this war has been going on for much longer, and the drums they use, the weapons they use, come from the Obeah. We are led to believe the Obeah are only above ground because the Fae are above ground. Have they always had these weapons that are coming from the Obeah? Or is this a recent development? Is this like a technical advancement of the war, the use of the Obeah? Like, did I miss something there? Am I misinterpreting the timeline? I just have a kind of soft question mark there. Now, in relation to the idea of the Fae, elves, and humans, I find this really interesting. I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I think our kind of preconceived ideas of them are going to be much different than what we're stepping into with this novel. This idea that even humans had magic when they were around, which I'm very interested in, because humans are not around as of this narrative, though I am willing to believe that by the end of the series, they may be around. I'm gonna put a little pin in that. We'll come back when the rest of the books are out. So I think that the way this world is being set up is really interesting. It's unique. It's vibrant. I love the sense of place that's being established here. And I really do enjoy the characters. I think we have a really interesting group here. And I think that's why I wanted to continue to see them pushed and the characterization pushed, because they are such great characters to work from and to build from. And I'm very interested to see how we're going to continue pushing them. And even as we are getting this narrative, particularly through two distinct points of view, it feels like a lot of these more traditionally side characters are very vibrant as well. So I'm really excited to see where the rest of this series ends up going. It is definitely an entry in the romantasy canon, I would argue, but also feels very distinct and unique. I love the queer representation here. I love the representation of disability that we see with Lettel, which I barely touched on, in that I am just now touching on it, and I don't have a whole lot of insight into that, but I loved seeing that represented. So yeah, as usual, if you have read this and have thoughts, please leave them below. As always, thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.